From the famous bull's horns formation of the Zulu, to the lightning raids of Numidian cavalry. This is how African war strategies have been adopted into global armies, and you will be shocked which ones are still taught in military academies around the world. But first, let's start with one of the most important battlefield strategies: guerrilla warfare. For centuries, European colonial forces invaded Africa with large armies and modern weapons. Instead of meeting them head-on, Africans turned the landscape into a weapon. Forests, rivers, mountains, and deserts became natural allies. Their neighbors became their eyes and ears. These fighters could move fast, ambush patrols, and vanish before they could strike back. This was not a random rebellion. It was a strategy born so they could be free. The Ethiopians frustrated Italian forces by blending guerrilla strikes with traditional battles. The Mau Mau fighters in Kenya waged guerrilla wars against British colonial forces in the 1950s. And then liberation armies in Angola, Mozambique, Algeria, and Guinea-Bissau refined these tactics into disciplined guerrilla warfare. They proved that higher technology is nothing if you are still looking for your enemy. But these innovations are not just in Africa. Special operations forces worldwide train using these exact principles. But it is not as dangerous and controversial as the poison weapons. Africa's use of poisoned weapons stretches deep into antiquity. Studies of the San people of southern Africa show sophisticated arrow poisons made from beetle larvae which are strong enough to bring down large game. Other groups use snake venom and plant toxins, creating highly effective biological weapons. Archaeological finds suggest such practices have ancient roots in regions like Sudan and southern Africa, though the exact date is still debated. What is clear is that enemies feared these weapons. Roman accounts mention Cushite archers whose poison arrows could mean death even from a small wound. It may be misleading to call this chemical warfare in the modern world, but these practices show a great knowledge of natural chemistry that scientists still study today. If you think this was a smart weapon, then you are underestimating Africa, because this next tactic was used by Hannibal of North Africa to defeat a Roman army twice its size. Cause in 216 BCE, Hannibal Barca of Carthage, a North African power based in present-day Tunisia, executed one of history's most brilliant maneuvers at the Battle of Cannae. He placed his weaker troops in the center, to lure the Romans. The cavalry struck from the sides while stronger soldiers pressed from behind, a classic double envelopment. Though this tactics existed elsewhere, Hannibal's success at Cannae is regarded as one of the finest tactical victories in history and remains important in military academies worldwide, but not as much as fortification and siege techniques. Cause when people imagine great fortresses, they think of European castles or Chinese walls. But centuries before these, Africa was already building sophisticated defensive systems that challenge anything found elsewhere in the world. Archaeology shows that as far back as 2500 BCE, the ancient kingdom of Kerma in Nubia built square fortresses with bastions, defensive ditches, and layered barriers. These were not just simple walls. They were brilliant systems of protection, walls thick enough to resist battering, towers placed for archers, and strategic positioning that gave defenders control of the battlefield before enemies even got close. One of the best examples is the fortress of Buhan, built near the Nile. Buhan had water-filled moats, tall stone walls, and narrow slits for archers to fire safely at attackers. Gates were reinforced with timber and metal, forcing enemies into choke points where they could be slaughtered. These designs predate many features later celebrated in European medieval castles. But Africa did not stop at stone walls. In West Africa, kingdoms like the Yoruba of Ife and the Benin Empire built powerful earthen walls and moats that were 4 times longer than the Great Wall of China. The Benin walls, built between the 9th and 15th centuries, stretched for over 16,000 kilometers combined. They made a living defense that protected cities, controlled trade, and intimidated rivals. Armies learned to cut off supply lines, redirect rivers, and use fire as weapons against fortified enemies. Later empires, including Rome and medieval Europe, adopted layered defenses, moats, and fortified towers that Africans had already mastered. And in modern times, the concept of defense in depth, multiple lines of fortification rather than a single wall, is still a cornerstone of military engineering. from World War II bunkers to today's military bases. But Africa needed to master the art of disappearing on the battlefield, so they made a single secret weapon that made them ruthless. It is called light cavalry hit-and-run tactics. Numidians of North Africa became legendary for their light cavalry. Riding bareback with no saddles or bridles, they carried small javelins and relied on speed and deception. They would appear suddenly, harass enemies, then disappear before a counterattack. They could control their horses with knee pressure and voice alone, leaving both hands free for throwing javelins. Their tactics were simple but brilliant: ride in close, throw the javelin, and run before the enemy could strike back. But this was a trick for their enemies, cause they will pretend to run so that overconfident enemies would chase, only to be ambushed moments later. The Numidians fighting under Hannibal executed these maneuvers so perfectly that Rome's massive army was destroyed in one of history's most famous encirclements. But later, at the Battle of Zama, 202 BCE, when the Numidians switched sides to fight for Rome, their speed again proved decisive in defeating Hannibal himself. Their mobility and precision were so effective that Roman generals later built entire cavalry doctrines inspired by them. But Numidians were not alone. Across the Sahel, in kingdoms like Mali, Songhai, and Kanem-Bornu, light cavalry became the backbone of imperial power. These riders dominated the wide savannas with hit-and-run attacks, lightning raids, and the ability to cover vast distances faster than infantry or supply wagons. Chroniclers describe Sahelian cavalry as terrifyingly fast, appearing seemingly out of nowhere, unleashing spears or arrows, and disappearing into the grasslands before an enemy force could regroup. In Ethiopia, mounted warriors combined mobility with guerrilla-like ambushes in the mountains, using horses to strike suddenly at invaders and then retreat to terrain where cavalry was least expected. The brilliance of African cavalry lay in its adaptability. Unlike heavy cavalry in Europe, which relied on shock charges, African riders perfected the idea that speed, deception, and flexibility could defeat raw power. Modern military strategists call this maneuver warfare, controlling movement and tempo rather than relying on brute force. Even today, modern mechanized units and reconnaissance forces operate with the same logic: hit fast, disrupt the enemy, and vanish before they can retaliate. The DNA of these tactics can be traced directly to African light cavalry who, centuries ago, made speed itself into a weapon. But all of these will not matter if there is division on the battlefield, cause African armies were organized by clan or family ties. Warriors fought alongside their relatives, which created loyalty, but also division. In battle, a man's first thought was often for his family's safety, not the king's command. Shaka Zulu saw this as a weakness and introduced a revolutionary system, the Amabutho, or age-grade regiments. Young men of the same age were grouped together, trained together, and lived in military barracks called Amakanda. They ate, slept, and fought side by side, transforming from herders and farmers into professional warriors. For the first time, loyalty shifted away from clan and bloodline, and toward the Zulu nation and its king. This meant warriors weren't just temporary fighters, they were soldiers, dedicated full-time to the art of war. This innovation didn't just unify the Zulu kingdom, it laid the foundation for the concept of professional army soldiers serving the state rather than family. But organization alone was not enough. Shaka also changed the way battles were fought. His most brilliant innovation was the buffalo horns formation, or impondo zankamo. The strategy divided the army into three parts: the chest held the enemy in place, the horns encircled from both sides, and the loins waited in reserve to finish the job. Enemies never realized they were surrounded until it was too late. This tactic reached its most famous test at the Battle of Isandlwana in 1879. 20,000 Zulu warriors faced just 1,800 British troops armed with rifles and artillery. But by sunset, the British force was defeated, making it one of the most humiliating defeats in colonial history. You can see all about it here, cause this video is over.